Last week, a very holy Jew, a shaliach, an emissary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Zvi Kogen, Hashem Yikam Domai, was murdered al Kiddush Hashem. He was buried this past Monday, November 25th, on Har HaZeisim, the Mount of Olives, adjacent to the Temple Mount. The family is still sitting Shiva, and the pain is still too raw to process. He was so young, only 28 years old, a newlywed, married just 6 months ago. Tzvi was a very special soul who devoted his life to helping others, spiritually and materially. He was murdered by vicious Islamic Nazis for no apparent reason other than the fact that he was a Jew. His loving father said at his funeral, with enormous pain and gushing tears, but with incredible faith, that the Jewish response to the tragic death of a loved one is Vayidoim Aaron. Aaron was silent after his 2 elder sons were taken from him by God, as recorded in Leviticus chapter 10. He accepted God's decree. While Tzvi's father, Rabbi Alexander, was experiencing the excruciating pain of a father losing his precious son in the prime of his youth, and just recently married, he was still able to state with conviction and clarity that he is certain that the reason his son was taken from him was because his son's mission on earth had been completed, and that the time had come for his soul to return to God. How it happened and who was involved was not relevant to Rabbi Alexander. To see a Jew with such amazing trust in God is beyond inspiring. Tzvi's holy soul joins the over 1,770 holy souls who have been taken from us since October 7th. Over 1,300 were murdered in cold blood, and the others killed in battle while defending their brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. They are all Kedoshim, holy souls, chosen by God to reach the highest levels of spiritual attainment humanly possible. They will all be returned to us after Moshiach comes, and their faces will radiate with such incredible spiritual brilliance that it will be hard to look at them without being blinded. As the prophet Daniel states toward the end of his book in chapter 12, verse 3, V'hamaskilim yazhiru kizoyar horokia, umatstiki harabim kikoichovim la'elam voed. They will shine like the radiance of the sky and like the stars forever and ever. The Kedoshim of this brutal war were joined to the millions of other Jews who have been murdered al Kiddush Hashem throughout our long and bitter exile. Tzvi's wife, Rivky, joins another 84 widows whose husbands have tragically been taken from them since October 7th. Nonetheless, there's something mysterious about Tzvi's murder that links him to the mysterious murder of his wife's uncle and aunt, Gabi and Rivky Holtzberg, who were murdered in Mumbai in 2008 on November 26, a day after Tzvi was buried. Another 4 Jews were also murdered in that gruesome terrorist rampage that took the lives of a total of 166 innocent human beings. Tzvi was 28 years old, like Rivky Holtzberg. Gavi was 29. They were all born in the Holy Land, and they all were buried in Har HaZeisim, overlooking the Temple Mount. They were all selfless individuals, Shluchim, emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They all made the same decision to live in faraway lands, away from their friends and extended families, and away from all the comforts and amenities that abound in the religious communities they grew up in. They chose a life of self-sacrifice for the sole purpose of being of service to other Jews whose souls yearned for spiritual nourishment. Aside from the above similarities, they were all murdered around the same time of the year. I need to give you a little background before I attempt to explain the significance of this connection. In 1977, on the 8th night of the holiday of Sukkot, called Shmini Atzeret, the Lubavitcher Rebbe suffered a massive heart attack. Dr. Ira Weiss, who became the Rebbe's personal and chief cardiologist, flew in immediately from Chicago and remained at the Rebbe's bedside until the Rebbe's complete recovery. The doctor has stated publicly that considering the massive damage to the Rebbe's heart and the fact that he was 75 years old, it is a miracle that he survived it all, let alone that he completely recovered in such a short time. On Rosh Chodesh Kislev, November 11th of that year, the Rebbe was declared completely healthy, and he returned to his home and to his incredibly demanding schedule. Since then, Chabad Hasidim the world over celebrate the day of Rosh Chodesh Kislev as a day of thanksgiving to Hashem, and a day of reaffirming and strengthening their commitment to selflessly devote more time and energy towards spreading Torah, mitzvot, holiness, godliness, and morality all over the world. Due to the significance of this day, the annual Kinus HaShluchim, the worldwide conference of all the Rebbe's emissaries, takes place at this time in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, the epicenter of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, ever since the previous Chabad Rebbe established his residence there in 1940. When these annual conventions were initiated in 1983, there were less than 100 participants. Today, there are well over 5,000. What I am about to say is obviously just a suggestion. I am not privy to what is going on in the spiritual realms. My knowledge of Torah, and certainly of its mystical dimension, is pathetic. How much more so when it comes to areas where nobody can claim mastery. Having said that, my own experience has taught me that finding some sort of metaphysical context helps me process tragic events, rather than just feeling numb and devastated, which doesn't do any good for anybody. The understanding of how things might fit into a grand plan, carefully orchestrated by God, inspires me to do more to be part of that grand plan, and to prepare myself for the ultimate fruition of this plan, rather than just experiencing emotional paralysis. And if contemplating these ideas helps me in a positive way, I wonder if it might help others as well. And this is why I am sharing with you the following. The fact that the Rebbe Shluchim were chosen to join the ranks of millions of others who have been murdered al Kiddush Hashem, specifically around the same time of the year that the Rebbe fully recovered from a severe heart attack and was almost taken from us, does not seem to be a coincidence. I was also contemplating the unlikelihood that disparate Islamic Nazi murderers chose Zvi, Gavi, and Rivky as important targets. The Mumbai terrorists were members of the Pakistani Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist army, who have been fighting with India over control of Kashmir for decades. This conflict has nothing to do with the Jews or with Israel. According to intercepted phone calls by Indian intelligence, the terrorists who attacked the Nariman house were told on the phone by their Pakistani controller that every person you kill where you are is worth 50 of the ones you killed elsewhere. But why? The same conundrum applies to the recent murder of Zvi Kogen. There are currently well over 1,000 Jews living in the Emirates. Since the signing of the Abraham Accords, about 1 million Israelis have visited the area. There are 9 direct flights from Tel Aviv to Dubai every single day, even during the current conflict. Among the many Jews who reside there are many who are in some way affiliated with the Israeli government. In contrast, Chabad has nothing to do with politics and does not involve itself in any issues other than spreading Torah and Judaism. Although they are present in Israel, Chabad is not in any shape or form an Israeli organization. They are present in every single Jewish community on the face of this earth and are headquartered in New York, not in Israel. Chabad does not speak out against Islam or any other religion. That's all they do is teach Torah and encourage Jews to do more mitzvahs. They service the spiritual and material needs of Jews in communities all over the world, and that's it. There is no logical reason why they should be considered high-profile targets for Islamic monsters. To make sense of this, I need to preface my remarks with the following insight, which I have shared with you before. The multi-front war being waged against the Jews of Israel by Iran and its many proxies, and with the active and passive support of practically every other nation on earth, including the United States, has nothing to do with the so-called Palestinian issue. This is quite obvious to any objective observer, and certainly to my listeners. But this war is also not simply a continuation of the age-old virus of anti-Semitism, which has plagued the nations of the world from time immemorial. Although anti-Semites of all types have jumped into the fray, this war is primarily not about the Jews in and of themselves. Although Muslims have partnered with Nazis and ingested their anti-Semitic filth hook, line, and sinker, on a metaphysical level, the current war against Israel is not powered by generic anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is simply used as a tactic and a tool. And this is why practically nobody has any clue how to fight this war. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is quite intelligent and who has authored 3 best-selling books on how to fight Islamic terrorism, is absolutely clueless. And so is practically every other commentator, even those who are fiercely pro-Israel and who are keenly aware of the nature of the monstrous Islamic enemies who surround the state of Israel on all sides. Because the truth is that even if every single Islamic state, including Iran and Turkey, even if all of them would join the Abraham Accords, this war would not end. Such accords, even if we can hypothetically imagine that they would lead to true normalization, in contrast to the so-called peace accords with Egypt and Jordan, which did nothing of the sort. But even if true normalization could occur, Israel would still be in a precarious position. Because if the Jews would even attempt to rebuild the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount, the accords and the normalizations would vaporize into nothingness in a matter of seconds. The goals of this current war, the wars of Gog and Magog, were revealed over 2,800 years ago by King David in Psalm chapter 2. Lomarog shugoyim ulu'umim yehegurik, yisyatzvu malchei eretz v'roiznim noistu yochad al Hashem v'al Mashiachoi, ninatko es meisrei semoi, v'nashlicho mimenu avisemoi. Why do all the nations and regimes gather together to utter absurdities? This refers to all the nations joining together to gang up on the Jews of Israel, as we are witnessing in real time. King David continues, the kings of the earth take their stand, and the leaders conspire together against God and against Moshiach. Let us tear off the cords of their yoke and cast off their ropes from us. Here, King David reveals the true metaphysical motivation of this war against Israel, which is, in essence, an effort to stop Mashiach from taking control of the world and replacing all other powers on earth. The psalm continues, he who sits in heaven laughs. God scoffs at them. He will speak to them in his anger, and in his wrath he will terrify them. It is I who appointed my king over Zion, my holy mountain. Of course, this refers to Melech HaMashiach, King Mashiach. Very few people get this, but recently I saw a clip from some Islamic preacher who actually does seem to get it. He told his listeners that even the Neturei Karta, who marched together with pro-Hamas protesters while wearing keffiyehs and holding Palestinian flags, who desecrate the Shabbat to attend Holocaust-denying conventions in Iran and the funeral of Ismail Haniyeh, Yamach Shemai. Even they declared this preacher are enemies of Islam. Why, he thundered? Because they too pray for their Mashiach, who they believe will abolish Islam and establish Judaism as the one and only religion on earth. This guy is a pretty smart dude. I'll put a link in the description below. Every single Islamic terror organization in the world and every single Islamic country in the world is powered by the metaphysical forces of Yishmael, who at this point in history are determined to hold on to power and not to submit to a Jewish Mashiach, who is a descendant of Yishmael's younger brother, Isaac. There are over 60 Islamic terror organizations in the world. Many of them are thousands of miles from Israel and have nothing to do with the so-called conflict in the Middle East. The fictitious Palestinian people mean less than nothing to them, yet metaphysically they are all linked and they are all part of this final confrontation between Isaac and Yishmael at the end of days. Now, the actual war of Gog and Magog, which is primarily an alliance between the United States and Iran, as we discussed in several videos, began in earnest in 1977, when President Jimmy Carter entered the Oval Office in January of that year. Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama were the most ferocious anti-Israel presidents in American history. Jimmy Carter made it the primary goal of his presidency to coerce the Israeli government into a lopsided deal, which would be the cause of all the troubles in the land of Israel ever since. Carter cynically seduced Menachem Begin to sign an agreement which would award the Egyptians with billions of dollars in American aid, plus sophisticated weaponry and training, plus territory twice the size of the state of Israel, territory which was captured from the Egyptians with the blood of thousands of Israeli soldiers, plus 4 air bases, plus the only oil field that Israel thought it possessed at the time. All in all, the Egyptians, who lost 3 existential wars against Israel, were paid billions by the victors of those wars. They were given priceless territory and armed to the teeth by the Americans. What Israel got in return was a worthless piece of paper. In addition, Begin, who was ostensibly a religious Jew, had to sign an agreement in which he blasphemed the Torah and the God of Israel by declaring that the Jews do not have exclusive rights to the land of Israel, and therefore they have to give up half of it to the Muslims, who cynically appropriated to themselves the name Palestinians after the biblical enemies of the Jews in the time of King David, the Pelishtim. Thus, begun the war in which the Muslims, with the support of America and practically every other nation on earth, would fight tooth and nail to wrest from the Jews the biblical heartlands of Judea and Samaria, plus Gaza, and most importantly, the Temple Mount and the holy city of Jerusalem surrounding it. To this very day, the very same forces continue their sinister efforts to pluck away these holy and integral parts of the eternal heritage of the Jewish people, the descendants of Isaac and Jacob, in order to block the kingdom of Moshiach from being established. The Rebbe fought with all his might to abort this terribly dangerous and blasphemous agreement, cynically called the Camp David Accords. King David was the one who once and for all crushed the ancient Palestinians, but this accord was meant to resurrect them so they can resume their fight against the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and, most importantly, against Moshiach. Now is not the time to go into detail about the Rebbe's Herculean efforts to abort this tragic mistake, which was the cause of so much suffering. I have in front of me 4 books that were written on this topic. Karasi ve'einoine, Shleimus ha'aretz, Das Teure, Shalom Shalom ve'ein Shalom. Our sources say that Moshiach, the son of Joseph, was meant to be killed while fighting these wars of Gog and Magog. The Rebbe suffered a massive heart attack, which nearly took his life in 1977, while he was fighting against the forces of Gog and Magog, both in the spiritual realms and also here on earth, through every possible means of communication and persuasion at his disposal. It is hard to ignore the theory that the Rebbe's severe heart attack was linked to the prophecies about the departure of the soul of Moshiach Ben Yosef from this world amidst his battle against the forces of Gog and Magog. The death of Moshiach Ben Yosef while fighting the wars of Gog and Magog is hinted to in Zechariah chapter 12, as explained in the Talmud in Tractate Sukkah, page 52a, and in Rashi there, as well as in many other sources. The Rebbe ultimately averted this decree. Our sources explicitly state that the death of Moshiach Ben Yosef may possibly be averted. The Zohar, the Holy Ari, the Or HaChaim, the Ramchal, the Gra, and many other sources speak about this explicitly. But apparently, this came with a heavy price. We are reminded of the decree against the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who was informed from heaven in 1791, at the age of 46, that his mighty spiritual war against the forces of darkness and evil, and his Herculean efforts to disseminate the secrets of Torah, which would ultimately lead to the coming of Moshiach, that all these efforts would result in his imminent demise from this world. One cannot ignore the similarity to the decree against Moshiach Ben Yosef for his efforts to bring about the final redemption. This mysterious cause and effect is not the subject of this video, and honestly, I don't claim to understand it, but it is undeniably true. Reb Shneir Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, informed his daughter, Devorah Leah, of this decree. She was 26 years old at the time, married with a 3-year-old child. She was able to avert the decree against her father, but not through prayer, but rather by substituting her soul with his. God took her pure and holy soul on the 3rd day of Tishrei, just after Rosh Hashanah of 1792. Her father lived another 20 years, during which, among his many other accomplishments, he published the Tanya, which revolutionized our understanding of God, the Torah, and of Judaism, ultimately paving the way for Mashiach. The details of this story are fascinating. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I have posted a link in the description below with the whole story. Is it then possible that the Rebbe's survival from a massive heart attack in 1977, which gave him another 17 years to complete his mission and put everything in place for the coming of Mashiach, is it possible that this was not the end of the story? Is it possible that the 1,200 holy souls who were killed al Kiddush Hashem on Shmini Atzeres last year are somehow linked to the Rebbe's heart attack 46 years earlier, also on Shmini Atzeres? The chapters in Zechariah after the one that hints to the death of Moshiach Ben Yosef speak about an enormous number of Jews who would suffer death, captivity, and rape. The prophet talks about half of the inhabitants of Jerusalem being affected, which we could assume would have amounted to tens of thousands, if not more. Is it possible that even though the death of Moshiach Ben Yosef was averted and the massive amount of Jews who would suffer was severely diminished, nonetheless, remnants of this decree still remained? Is it also possible that the holy souls of the Rebbe's devoted emissaries, Gavi and Rivky Holtzberg and Zvi Kogen, who were killed al Kiddush Hashem, around the same time the Rebbe fully recovered from his heart attack on Rosh Chodesh Kislev? Is it possible that all these souls are intrinsically linked? Is it possible that these holy and devoted Shluchim, who are like children of the Rebbe, is it possible that they were chosen, like the holy and righteous Devorah Leah, who took the place of her father? She left a young orphan, only 3 years old, and Rivky left her 2-year-old son Moshe, who was miraculously saved by his Indian nanny. Would it also not make perfect sense that the metaphysical forces of Yishmael, whose primary goal in this war was and is to prevent the emergence of the Messianic era, is it possible that this is why they would focus their attention on the person who declared as his primary goal to do, through the agency of his Shluchim, all that is necessary to bring about the Messianic era? This was precisely the Rebbe's declaration on the day he accepted the leadership of the Chabad movement on the 10th day of the Jewish month of Shevat in 1951. Is it possible that this is why targeting his emissaries was of extreme importance to the dark forces of Ishmael and Gog and Magog? Before I let you go, I'd like to share with you a few more points. This is also the time of year when we read in synagogues the world over the portions of Chaye Sarah and Toldos, Genesis chapters 23 through 28. The last verse in the portion of Chaye Sarah hints to the fall of Yishmael, al pnei kol echov nofal. And this verse is directly followed by the first verse in the section of Toldos, Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak ben Avram, which signifies the establishment of the eternal Jewish nation through Isaac and Jacob, which will ultimately reach its climax in the Messianic era. Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, author of the famous code of Jewish law called the Tur, who passed away in 1340, points out in his commentary to the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, that the juxtaposition of these two verses signifies that the fall of Yishmael will only occur with the coming of Mashiach. Could it be that it is specifically during this time of year that the forces of Yishmael, in their attempt to somehow hold back the emergence of Mashiach, deliberately attacked representatives of the Rebbe who devoted their lives to prepare the world for Mashiach? As mentioned earlier, Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama were the two most vicious anti-Israel presidents in American history. We spoke about Jimmy Carter's serpentine role to force upon Menachem Begin the lopsided anti-Israel Camp David Accords. Now let's talk a little about his partner in crime, the other incredibly vicious anti-Israel American Islamic president named Hussein. Obama spent his terms in office strengthening, funding, and incentivizing Iran to live up to its preordained role to fight against Mashiach in the wars of Gog and Magog. As explicit in Ezekiel chapter 38, we're the only nation in the alliance against the Jewish state at the end of days which can be identified with absolute certainty as Paras, the Hebrew name for Persia. Obama was voted into office on November 4th, 2008. A mere 22 days later, the Chabad House in Mumbai was attacked by Islamic Nazis, powered by the same spiritual forces of Ishmael who put Hussein Obama in the Oval Office. The link is too glaring to ignore. Let me conclude with something we can declare with absolute confidence. King David continues in Psalm number 2 we quoted earlier, Yoshev b'shamayim yischok, Hashem yilag lomoy, oz yidaber elemoy v'apoy v'charoino yivahalemoy, v'ani nosachti malki al Tzion har kodshi. God laughs at the futile efforts of the armies of Gog and Magog. He confronts them and terrifies them with his declaration that all their efforts are null and void, for he has anointed his righteous Messiah to establish his kingdom on earth, with its epicenter on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The tragic murder of the Rebbe's devoted emissaries, as well as the horrific events of October 7th and its aftermath, not only were completely ineffectual in delaying the emergence of Mashiach and the onset of the redemption, but to the contrary, the incredible power of the Kiddush Hashem of so many righteous souls unleashed an enormous explosion of spiritual light and power, which ultimately will deal the final blow to all the powers of evil and darkness. In addition, aside from the nuclear annihilation of the forces of evil in the heavens above, these terrible tragedies awakened within the Jewish people here on earth a tremendous sense of unity and purpose, which will continue to grow and eventually inspire each and every Jew on this planet, as well as many millions of righteous Gentiles, as we march towards the final redemption, speedily in our days. Amen. Ken Yehi Ratzon.